Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating moment in English history. It's a time when your family name and your skill with a sword were suddenly not enough. It's a story about rivalry, a massive identity crisis, and how an entire ruling class had to completely reinvent itself.
So let's get right into it. Picture this. It's late 16th century England. And for hundreds of years, if you were born a noble, your spot at the top was pretty much guaranteed. But all of a sudden, that started to change. The very definition of power was shifting, and the rules of the game were being rewritten right under the aristocracy's feet.
And this slide, it just lays out the whole conflict perfectly. On one side, you've got the old code. Life was all about grand gestures, throwing lavish parties in your honor on the battlefield. But then this new set of rules starts creeping in, what you might call a new Protestant ethic. Suddenly it's about hard work, being smart with your money, and knowing how to run things. This wasn't just a minor tweak, it was a head-on collision of two totally different ways of life, a real battle for the soul of the English elite.
Now, you can see this epic struggle perfectly in the rivalry between two of Queen Elizabeth's most powerful courtiers. Seriously, these two guys were the living, breathing symbols of these two competing worlds. First up, we've got Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. This guy was the poster boy for the old-school nobility of the sword. His family had been in the high-stakes game of power for generations, and, often lost spectacularly. Both his dad and his granddad were executed. He was charming, a military man, the Queen's great love, and he absolutely believed that his power was his birthright. And on the other side, you have William Cecil, Lord Burghley. He's the ultimate example of the new nobility of the robe, a true self-made man who came from a pretty humble background and rose to the top through pure hard work and being incredibly good at his job. He was careful, pragmatic, a genius of bureaucracy, and the Queen's most trusted advisor. His power wasn't inherited, it was earned, day in and day out, for 40 years. And look, their differences were just about personality. They represented two completely different futures for England. And this whole rivalry played out in the most important room in the kingdom, the Queen's Privy Council. The Privy Council was the main battleground. This was the Queen's inner circle of advisors. Now, Queen Elizabeth, like her father and grandfather, knew that the big, powerful noble families could be trouble. So she very deliberately packed her council not with the great lords, but with loyal, competent administrators, guys who owed everything to her and her alone.
This quote from a merchant in 1601, wow, it just captures the mood perfectly. "What are the Cecils?" he asked, and you can just hear the contempt in his voice. It shows you the absolute shock people felt seeing a guy with no noble blood wielding so much power. To them, it must have felt like the world was being turned completely upside down.
See, for the old guard like Dudley, power was a performance. It was all about the show. Spending huge amounts of money and looking down on being a man of business were signs that you were just naturally superior. It was actually seen as kind of tacky to worry about making money. The important thing was how extravagantly you spent it. But for the new guys like Cecil, power was all about management. It wasn't about flashy displays. It was about grinding it out, day after day, behind the scenes. Caution, diplomacy, and knowing every single nut and bolt of how the state worked. These were the new weapons of power. And right in the middle of this whole web of rivalry was Queen Elizabeth herself. And she was no bystander, let me tell you. She was a master puppeteer, and she skillfully used this conflict to make her own role even stronger. This timeline just gives you a little taste of the constant, high-stakes drama. Elizabeth was a genius at keeping everyone off balance. She let her council argue for years about who she should marry or whether England should go to war in the Netherlands. She let Dudley's war faction clash with Cecil's peace faction. Why? Because by keeping them fighting each other, she made sure no single group could ever get powerful enough to control her. And she was not subtle about who was in charge. When Robert Dudley, the man she probably loved more than anyone, pushed her too far, she famously shot back with this: "I will have here one mistress and no master." She made it crystal clear. She was the ultimate authority, and she played the massive egos of these powerful men against each other like a violin. So this rivalry wasn't just some juicy court drama. It was really a symptom of a much bigger crisis that was hitting the entire traditional nobility, a crisis that threatened their very reason for being. This number says it all: 18. In her entire 45-year reign, Queen Elizabeth only created 18 new nobles.
Now, the kings who came after her would hand out titles like they were party favors, but she deliberately kept the aristocracy a tiny, exclusive club. She was stopping them from getting too big for their boots. And they were getting hit from all sides. Their money was drying up thanks to their crazy spending and rising prices. Their whole military purpose, leading their own private armies, was basically gone as the queen took control. And there was this powerful new class of rich landowners, the gentry, nipping at their heels. Even the very values they lived by were suddenly looking, well, lazy. Now, don't get me wrong, they still had some serious perks. A noble couldn't be thrown in jail for being in debt. They got a special trial by their fellow nobles, and they had a permanent seat in the House of Lords. But these privileges, which had once been the foundation of their power, just weren't enough anymore to keep them at the very top of the social ladder. So this whole crisis didn't actually destroy the aristocracy, but it did change it forever. It basically forced the nobility to either adapt or become irrelevant. And in doing so, it created a whole new kind of English elite. The future, it turned out, belonged to a hybrid. The nobles who survived, and even thrived, were the ones who could do both. They were the ones who blended their old-school land and wealth with the new-school administrative skills of guys like Cecil. They learned to act less like medieval warlords and more like modern, savvy politicians and businessmen.
So you can really boil this whole great power shift down into 3 basic steps. First, you had the old power, based purely on who your parents were. Then came the crisis, which shook that old model to its core. And out of that, a new power emerged, a fusion, where your birth still mattered, but you had to back it up with actual competence.
And that transformation, forged in the fiery court of Queen Elizabeth I, leaves us with a really interesting question for our own time. Is that fundamental clash between inherited status and earned merit really over? Or does that same tension between old money and new talent, between birthright and hustle, just look a little different today?